She stands before the mirror, adjusting her collar for the third time this morning. In the reflection, she sees not herself, but the woman she must become to survive another day in a world that devours the hesitant. There once lived a woman who discovered a peculiar crown in her grandmother's attic, not gold or silver, but woven from threads of pure ambition. The moment she placed it upon her head, she felt a surge of electricity through her spine. Suddenly, conversations bent toward her like flowers following the sun. Meetings that once excluded her now hung on her every word. Men who had dismissed her with patronizing smiles now studied her face with newfound respect. The crown was invisible to everyone else, yet its weight grew heavier each day. She found herself walking differently, straighter, with purpose that cut through rooms like a blade. Her voice dropped an octave when she spoke of budgets and deadlines. Her laughter became strategic, deployed only when it served her ascension. But the crown demanded tribute. Each night, as she removed it carefully and placed it on her nightstand, she glimpsed the woman she used to be in the mirror. Softer around the edges, more prone to apology, quicker to defer. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone weak and naive who believed kindness alone could build kingdoms. The crown whispered Schopenhauer's bitter truth, that in the theater of human relations, the will to power masquerades as every other virtue, and those who refuse to acknowledge this fundamental drive are destined to remain in the audience, watching others claim their rightful stage. One morning, she woke to find the crown had grown roots into her scalp overnight. She could no longer remove it, could no longer remember the texture of her hair without its weight. She had become the crown, and the crown had become her, an eternal sovereign of her own making, ruling over a kingdom built from the bones of who she once was. In the mirror now, she saw only power looking back, beautiful, terrible, and absolutely necessary. The ancients called it a curse. Today, psychology names it the masculine persona adoption, the unconscious mirroring of traditionally masculine power displays by women navigating patriarchal structures. First identified by Carl Jung as parts of his anima/animus theory, this phenomenon manifests everywhere, in boardrooms where women lower their voices to command respect, in relationships where vulnerability becomes a strategic liability, in social media where feminine authenticity gets buried under performative strength. Schopenhauer would recognize this as a particularly cruel trick of the will, forcing women to become the very thing that oppresses them in order to survive within its system. The will to power doesn't discriminate by gender. It simply demands that everyone who wishes to ascend must speak its language of dominance and control. In myth, she was Athena, born armored from Zeus's head. In you, she's the mask you wear when kindness feels like weakness. What does your crown look like? What did you have to kill inside yourself to wear it? And in the dark moments before dawn, do you still remember the weight of your own head without it? Or has the crown become so fused with your skull that you can no longer tell where power ends and you begin? Some crowns are prisons. We build one thread at a time, convincing ourselves we're weaving freedom. Weakness doesn't vanish. It gets archived in the memory of every woman who stops desiring you. He scrolls through her Instagram, studying each photo like an archaeologist examining fragments of a civilization he no longer recognizes, one where his attention alone was enough to make her eyes light up. In a city where love went to die, there stood a peculiar museum that only opened after midnight. Its curator, a woman with eyes like broken compasses, collected the remnants of men who had failed to hold her interest. The exhibits were haunting in their ordinariness. A text message sent at 2 a.m. asking you up, displayed behind bulletproof glass. A wilted bouquet with a card reading, "I'm sorry for whatever I did." A mirror reflecting the face of a man practicing his apologies to empty rooms. The museum's centerpiece was the Hall of Almost, where relationships went to fossilize. Here, she had preserved their moments of weakness with scientific precision. The night he cried about his mother's expectations while she consoled him but felt something inside her recoil. The dinner where he deferred to her choice of restaurant for the 4th time running, and her attraction died a little more. The morning he asked if she still loved him with such desperate hope that her yes felt like a lie even as she spoke it. Each exhibit bore a placard written in her careful handwriting. Subject displayed excessive emotional availability, mistaking vulnerability for intimacy. Specimen failed to maintain psychological boundaries, creating asymmetrical power dynamic. Subject sought validation rather than providing leadership, resulting in maternal transference and subsequent romantic decay. The most disturbing wing contained the mirror gallery, rows upon rows of reflective surfaces that showed not the viewer's face, but the face they wore when trying to please her. Men would stumble through this gallery in horror, watching themselves transform from confident individuals into desperate supplicants, their features softening into apologetic masks that begged for her approval. As Schopenhauer observed, the will manifests differently in men and women. In men, it drives them to conquer and possess, but when that drive becomes perverted into the need to be conquered and possessed, it violates the fundamental architecture of desire itself. But the museum held one final secret. In the basement, accessible only to the curator herself, was a single exhibit labeled "The Man Who Never Came." It was an empty case, perfectly lit, containing nothing but a velvet pedestal and a small placard. Subject maintained independent will. Specimen remains uncaptured. Late at night, she would stand before this empty case, and for reasons she couldn't name, it was the only exhibit that made her weep. The ancients called it the hero's journey. Today, psychology names it the Nietzsche syndrome, the unconscious belief that emotional availability and deference will generate attraction. First documented by Robert Glover in his analysis of approval-seeking behaviors, this pattern manifests in modern dating through endless texting without escalation, excessive accommodation that erodes sexual tension, and the transformation of romantic pursuit into therapeutic relationship where the woman becomes mother rather than lover. Schopenhauer understood that the will to life operates through the tension between pursuit and resistance. When men abandon their fundamental drive to overcome obstacles and instead position themselves as the obstacle to be overcome, they violate the basic mechanics of desire itself. The will cannot be seduced, it can only be challenged. In myth, he was Actaeon, torn apart for witnessing the goddess's vulnerability. In you, he's the part that dies a little each time you choose safety over risk. Have you ever caught yourself building a museum to house the men who disappointed you with their weakness? What do the placards in your secret gallery say about the power you never knew you wielded? And in your basement of unrequited longings, what empty case calls to you in the darkness? What strength do you crave that you've never allowed yourself to name? Even curators sometimes forget they're collecting their own loneliness, one rejected specimen at a time. The most elegant prisons are the ones we build and then call them purpose. She builds her schedule like a fortress wall, each appointment a stone placed with military precision, every minute accounted for, every possibility of spontaneity murdered in advance, and she calls this freedom. There once was a woman who discovered she possessed a terrible gift. She could construct chains out of pure logic. These weren't the crude iron shackles of obvious oppression, but delicate structures woven from responsibility, necessity, and the profound satisfaction of being indispensable. She had learned this architecture from watching the men around her, how they built cages out of noble purpose, how they convinced themselves that their imprisonment was actually leadership. Her chains were masterpieces of engineering. Each link was forged from a different necessity: her elderly mother's medication schedule, her daughter's violin lessons, her husband's dietary restrictions, her team's impossible deadlines. She wore these chains like jewelry, their weight distributed so perfectly across her shoulders that she barely felt them anymore. Visitors admired their craftsmanship, how seamlessly she had integrated duty into identity, how gracefully she carried the weight of everyone else's needs. But the most ingenious aspect of her design was the lock mechanism. It could only be opened from the outside. She had constructed a system where her liberation required someone else's permission, someone else's recognition of her sacrifice. The key hung just out of her reach, and she spent her days stretching toward it while adding new links to her beautiful bondage. Other women would visit her workshop, marveling at the intricate patterns she had mastered. "Teach us," they would whisper, and she would show them how to transform guilt into purpose, how to alchemize resentment into indispensability. She never mentioned that late at night, she would run her fingers along the chains and remember what her skin felt like when it was free to breathe. The workshop walls were covered with blueprints for even more elaborate designs, chains that looked like career ladders, chains disguised as family traditions, chains that masqueraded as moral superiority. Schopenhauer's observation echoed through the rafters, that we are rarely enslaved by others, but rather become masters of our own imprisonment, convincing ourselves that our self-imposed limitations are virtues. One day, a child wandered into her workshop and asked a question that shattered every chain simultaneously. "Why don't you just put them down?" The woman looked at her empty hands in wonder, then at the pile of beautiful, unnecessary metal at her feet. For the first time in years, she felt the dangerous lightness of choice. The ancients called it virtue. Today, psychology names it learned helplessness, the conditioned belief that we have no control over our circumstances, even when we do. First identified by Martin Seligman through his experiments with dogs who stopped trying to escape electric shocks, even when escape became possible. This phenomenon manifests in modern women through the overscheduling that prevents intimacy, the perfectionism that masks fear of judgment, the caretaking that substitutes service for genuine connection. Schopenhauer would recognize this as the will turned against itself. The life force corrupted into a system of self-denial that feels virtuous but actually serves to avoid the terror and responsibility of authentic freedom. The will to power becomes the will to serve, which is really the will to remain safely powerless. In myth, she was Penelope, weaving by day and unraveling by night. In you, she's the part that builds elaborate prisons and calls them purpose. What chains have you crafted so beautifully that you've forgotten their chains? What responsibilities have you welded to your wrists so skillfully that you no longer remember the weight of your own arms? And if someone handed you the key right now, if all your obligations suddenly dissolved, would you take it? Or would you insist that your shackles are actually jewelry? The most elegant prisons are the ones we mistake for palaces, complete with golden bars we polish every morning. Some hearts starve on certainty and feed only on the thrill of the unreachable. She swipes left on the available, right on the unavailable, her thumb trained by years of practice to distinguish between men who might love her and men who definitely won't. The algorithm has learned her patterns: married, distant, or damaged. These are her preferred species. In a tower that stretched beyond the clouds lived a woman who collected only the rarest specimens of masculinity, men who existed just outside the realm of possibility. Her collection was vast and meticulously curated. The married professor whose wedding ring caught the light as he discussed Kafka, the emotionally unavailable artist who painted her into his landscapes but never into his future, the recovering addict whose sobriety made him sacred and untouchable, the friend's ex-husband whose forbidden nature made every glance electric with transgression. Each specimen was preserved in amber moments, stolen conversations in empty hallways, text messages that meant everything and nothing, glances across crowded rooms that felt like communion. She had become a connoisseur of almosts, an expert in the exquisite torture of perpetual pursuit. Her tower room was filled with glass cases containing fragments of these impossible loves. A business card with a personal phone number written in careful script, a book recommendation that felt like a love letter, a thinking of you message sent at 3 a.m. that he deleted minutes later. What made her collection so valuable was precisely its impossibility. The married man's unavailability transformed ordinary conversation into profound connection. The artist's emotional distance made every small kindness feel monumental. The addict's boundaries turned simple friendship into epic romance. She had discovered that desire wasn't about having, it was about wanting, and nothing amplified wanting quite like impossibility. But the tower had one terrible feature, a room of mirrors that showed her the available men she had ignored. They appeared ghostly in the reflection, kind faces, open hearts, hands reaching toward her across the divide of her indifference. These were the men who had wanted to build something real with her, who had offered presence instead of absence, certainty instead of the thrilling vertigo of maybe. The mirrors whispered Schopenhauer's cruelest insight, that we desire only what resists us, and the moment something becomes obtainable, it loses its capacity to enchant. The will feeds on obstacles, remove them, and the will starves. In the highest room of her tower, she kept her most prized possession, a chair that had never been sat in, reserved for the one man who would never climb her stairs. It was polished to perfection, facing a window that looked out onto everything she couldn't have. Some nights, she would sit across from this empty chair and have entire conversations with its occupant, the phantom lover who existed only in the space between wanting and having. The view from her tower was breathtaking, but she had forgotten how to come down. The ancients called it divine madness. Today, psychology names it repetition compulsion, the unconscious tendency to recreate familiar patterns of pain, particularly in relationships, first identified by Freud as the drive to repeat traumatic experiences in an attempt to master them. This phenomenon manifests in modern dating through the preference for emotionally unavailable partners, the unconscious filtering out of healthy relationships, and the transformation of pursuit itself into the primary source of romantic satisfaction. Schopenhauer would understand this as the will trapped in a cycle of perpetual wanting, never allowing itself the satisfaction of having, because satisfaction would mean the end of desire, and desire is the only thing that makes us feel alive. The will chooses suffering over emptiness, drama over peace, because at least suffering confirms that we exist. In myth, she was Tantalus, reaching eternally for fruit that withdrew at her touch. In you, She's the part that equates love with longing and runs from anything that might actually fulfill you. What tower have you built to house your impossible loves? How many available hearts have you walked past while chasing shadows? And in your highest room, what empty chair are you protecting? What fantasy lover are you preserving by refusing to let reality touch them? Sometimes the most passionate love affairs are the ones that never happen, because they never get the chance to disappoint us. The most dangerous freedom is remembering you were whole before love ever touched you. She deletes another dating app, tells herself she's taking a break from men, but what she's really taking a break from is the exhausting performance of needing to be needed. In the silence of her empty apartment, she hears something that terrifies her more than loneliness, the sound of her own completeness. In the abandoned district of the city, where weeds pushed through concrete and silence grew like moss, there lived a woman who had inherited a garden from a grandmother she had never known. The deed arrived with a rusty key and a note written in faded ink. What you're looking for was buried here long ago. Water it with your tears, tend it with your fury, and watch what grows. The garden was overgrown with the strangest plants she had ever seen, vines that bore fruit shaped like forgotten dreams, flowers that bloomed only in darkness and smelled of Saturday mornings in childhood, trees whose roots spelled out words and languages she somehow understood, sovereignty, wildness, enough. As she began to clear the garden, she discovered artifacts buried in the soil like archaeological evidence of a civilization that had been deliberately forgotten. Here was a paintbrush, thick with dried paint, belonging to the artist she had been before she learned that women who created things made men uncomfortable. There was a leather-bound journal filled with her own handwriting, documenting dreams she had abandoned the moment someone suggested they were impractical. Deeper in the earth, she found a small wooden box containing the voice she had used before she learned to make herself smaller in rooms, higher in pitch, more apologetic in its assertions. Each artifact she unearthed began to restore something she hadn't realized she'd lost. The paintbrush warmed in her hands, and suddenly she could see colors again, not just the muted palette of compromise she had been using to paint her life, but the bold strokes of want and will and absolute refusal to settle. The journal fell open to pages that wrote themselves, recording thoughts she had forbidden herself to think, that she was not half of someone else's whole, that her solitude was not a problem to be solved, but a strength to be cultivated. But the most profound discovery waited at the garden's center, a mirror that reflected not her face, but her face as it would look if she had never learned to arrange it for male approval. The woman in the reflection stood differently, not leaning toward anyone, not softening her edges, not performing tight, delicate choreography of femininity designed to make others comfortable. This woman looked like she could build her own castle, fight her own battles, love herself with the fierce devotion she had always reserved for others. The garden whispered Schopenhauer's ultimate paradox, that the will to live was not about finding another, but about finding the wholeness within oneself that made another merely delightful rather than necessary. The greatest power was not the power to attract, but the power to not need to attract, to be so complete in one's own existence that love became a choice rather than a compulsion. As seasons passed, the garden taught her its deepest secret, that the masculine energy she had been seeking in others had always lived inside her, not as aggression or hardness, but as the capacity for decisive action, for solitary strength, for the kind of self-possession that made others lean in, not from her neediness, but from her abundance. Women began to visit her garden, drawn by rumors of its transformative power. They would arrive, carrying the weight of their romantic disappointments, their endless analyses of text messages, their exhaustion from performing emotional availability as if it were a job. She would hand them each a shovel and say simply, "Start digging. You'll know when you find it." Some left after an hour, uncomfortable with the silence, the dirt under their fingernails, the terrible responsibility of tending their own growth. But others stayed, and as they worked, she would watch them discover the same truth she had learned, that the most magnetic force in the world was not the energy of seeking, but the energy of being sought, not because you needed it, but because you were worth seeking. In the evening, when the garden glowed with its strange luminescence, she would sit among her reclaimed artifacts and feel something she had forgotten was possible, the deep satisfaction of being enough, not enough for someone else, but enough, period. The sentence complete, without a second clause, without conditions, or qualifications, or the need for external validation. The ancients called it sovereignty. Today, psychology names it secure attachment to self, the ability to generate internal validation and maintain emotional equilibrium independent of romantic relationships. First described by John Bowlby in Attachment Theory, this phenomenon manifests in modern life through comfort with solitude, decision-making based on internal values rather than external approval, and the capacity to engage in relationships from choice rather than neediness. Schopenhauer would recognize this as the highest expression of the will, not as endless wanting, but as the rare moment when the will achieves temporary satisfaction through self-knowledge and accepts its own completeness. This is the paradox he glimpsed, but could never fully embrace, that the cessation of wanting doesn't lead to emptiness, but to fullness. In myth, she was Artemis, goddess of the hunt, who needed no one's permission to run through the forest. In you, she's the part that remembers what you were like before you learned to make yourself smaller for love. What artifacts of your forgotten strength lie buried in your own soil? What would your face look like if you had never learned to arrange it for approval? And if you stopped watering the relationships that require you to be less than you are, what wild and magnificent thing might grow in that newly fertile ground? The most dangerous thing a woman can do is remember that she is not a supporting character in someone else's story. She is the author of her own.